Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians 7 is a very, very strong passage. I mean, it comes out in a really surprisingly strong language Paul uses to emphasize the fact that singleness is not only an option, but in a situation that they were in was a preferable option.
Since you're there, can you expound what, because of the present crisis, like what is,
Yeah.
like just, because that seems to be kind of the modifier for the rest of that whole passage, or like the prerequisite, everything else that he's saying.
Yes.
So what does that kind of mean?
Yeah, so there's a couple of references here that I think are important. One is his statement, because of the present crisis, and then he says later that, however, those who get married at this time will have troubles. And then he says the time that remains is very short. So he keeps referring to a specific time frame, and so that's important. And I think also then if you read in 1 Timothy. What's surprising to me is 1 Timothy is written quite a bit after 1 Corinthians, and he deals with marriage and widows and all of these things in a lot of places in 1 Timothy, and there's almost no mention of singleness at all. He's really emphasizing marriage. He's basically saying you have to be married to be an elder. He says if you're a widow, even you're young, you should get remarried. He says in 1 Timothy 4 that some people are forbidding marriage, and he comes out incredibly strong against that idea. But he doesn't say anything to counterbalance that about the value of singleness. So yeah, there's different positions on this. I think he's actually referring to a very specific crisis that they were going through. There was persecution that the Corinthian church was under. It was a really difficult place to be a Christian, and so this reference to the crisis and the problem going on and the short period of time. I just have a really hard time imagining that when he says the time is very short, this present crisis, talking about a very persecuted group of believers, that applies for thousands of years after that. You also have in this passage the only time in the whole New Testament where an apostle says, "This is my opinion," and so this is not from the Lord. And so that comes up in this passage as well. So you have on one hand Paul's incredibly strong statements about singleness. On the other hand, you have a lot of these almost disclaimers, So, well, what do you guys think? Any other thoughts on that?
Jeremy, with regard to the crisis, I guess
Yeah.
we've seen elsewhere in the letter that possibly goes out. He does talk a lot about sexual immorality.
Yeah. Right.
So I always tend to read that like there's a crisis of immorality, maybe in addition to.
The problem with that, though, is his solution to sexual morality is marriage.
Yeah.
So it seems like if that were the crisis, he would not be talking about singleness, because he contrasts that and says, but if you're struggling with sexual morality, you should get married. So that's I was wondering that too, and then I saw that pattern. So there's a pattern that I feel like is sort of being contrasted, which is if you live in a culture where the church is being persecuted, the amount of singleness in the church should rise. And if you live in a culture where there's a lot of sexual immorality in the culture, the level of singleness should go down. So, because this is his primary way, he says it over and over again, his way of combating sexual immorality is monogamous marriage.
Do you think his views on when he thought Christ was returning figures into this at all? I mean, I'd always kind of heard that growing up, that Paul thought that Christ's return was like imminent.
Right.
Like coming very soon.
Yes. And had he known it was going to be this long, what would he have said? Yeah. It is true that if you just sort of read his letters chronologically, like his first letters were 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, and there tends to be a much bigger emphasis on that idea, and in 1 Corinthians, and than in his later letters. So yeah, that's not, I think, to at all be diminish the authority of what he said. I think that it was actually intentional on the part of the Holy Spirit to want every generation to anticipate the coming of the Lord. But it becomes really complicated when you are doing that and you're actually changing your lifestyle because you believe it's so likely. So you're like making decisions, say, I would get married, but because I think there's a 90% chance the Lord will return sometime in the next 20 years, I'm not going to get married. I don't know. I would push back on that reasoning unless the signs are so overwhelmingly clear. But I think you're right. I think that probably did factor into his initial thoughts about this. Yeah, what else do you guys see here?
Well, he's doing a lot of he's doing this. He's speaking from his own perspective. He's giving his opinion.
Yeah.
And as a single guy who's got a following, it's kind of all he has.
Yeah.
I don't mean he doesn't have a word from the Lord or any of that stuff, but you know, if he's making disciples and he's going into towns and doing that, the thing that he has to offer is, I'm a single guy. I can show you how to do that. He can't necessarily say, hey, look at my marriage and here's how you live.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a bias towards this, but he also is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
He is
So,
big, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the New Testament goes. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. I mean, you can't really show a whole lot of like
Yeah.
going in, laying a foundation, and moving on. So he's speaking from his perspective, and it's obviously very good. More of an observation, I guess.
Yeah. I
Not to be
agree with that.
confusing this, but wasn't there a theory though that he actually might have been married and then left the wife behind, or maybe she left him because of his commitment to Christ? Is that, am I crossing a...
Well, yeah, nobody knows.
Scholar.
Yeah, the reason why a lot of people think Paul might have been married is because he called himself a Pharisee in one of the books, and he was studied under Gamaliel and became a Pharisee, which you had to be married. And so then of course the speculation starts with what happened to this wife, and that's where you get a lot of different ideas. But it's really, yeah, there's really nothing authoritative about if he was, and if he was, then what happened to his wife. But yeah, it is interesting how I agree that more than any other topic, Paul's actual personal situation, because he's bringing out his opinion, and and he's referring to himself multiple times in 1 Corinthians 7, I want you to be like me, that his personal life comes into this topic in a really unusual way, I think, compared to other topics. I wouldn't, if we're talking about the Holy Spirit, it's not that relevant to talk about necessarily Paul's personal story, but in this area, it's very relevant because he cites it as a relevant thing. And this is really a big deal because, again, this is like, how do we view marriage and singleness in the church today, and what's biblical singleness? What's our position on it, given the fact that, so that's sort of another big question is, if you were to read these things and someone to say, okay, give me a balanced understanding of singleness when it comes to the Bible, what are things that would stand out to you as like, okay, this would be a really critical part that somebody would have to understand to have a biblical understanding of this? Any thoughts? Go ahead, Isaac.
I've read other translations that say it's better to marry than like earn a desire, to be like overcome their desire. things
Right.
Like that. Do you know any of the background of that word, or like what that
Yeah, I think that's,
implies?
well, yeah, most people, I've never heard anybody try to argue that it didn't imply sexual desire. So I think that's the reason. The word lust there is a little more negative than I think the word actually was. It was more of a burning, and sort of, I don't think it had the connotation as to whether or not it was a bad thing or not, like if it was a sinful. The thing about that, and he brings it up multiple times, he's really asking a very specific question, and that is like, how desperate are you to have sex? Like that is, he wants to know that to decide how to respond to you. in terms of this area. And it's very important to him that that be one of the, if not the most critical question when it comes to the urgency of this question. So he's like, he specifically says this, about this issue here in the first passage in 1 Corinthians 7. He talks about it later about, we're going to look at another passage where he refers to it again. He tells somebody who is engaged, if you're not treating your fiance inappropriately and you're completely under control and under your own will, then you should wait. And if you feel like you are treating her inappropriately and that you're going to cross the line, you should get married. So he's constantly asking this really specific question, like getting into your business, like how serious is this in your life? How big of a, because he says also here, I want you to, in the, sort of the second to the bottom, I want you to do whatever will help you serve the Lord best with as few distractions as possible. So he's sort of asking, which is the worst distraction in your life? Is this, is all the distractions that comes with the married life compared to the distractions that come from your sexual desire, which one is actually throwing you off more? And another really, I think, important observation to make is that then that sort of begs the question, how distracting is the married life? And I think one of the things that has to be kind of explored a little bit is the married life might have been a lot more distracting in his time than it is today. It would take a woman almost an entire day to make dinner, for example. They didn't have like Rachel Ray or microwave ovens or like supermarkets or whatever. So you could do what kinds of distractions, things would distract them. Are they really going to distract you? So you have to really weigh. And now, of course, if you have lots and lots of kids and you don't prevent pregnancy, you're going to get your married life is going to get a lot more complicated than your single life was. But that's the balance that he's really asking people to consider as well, is like, which is distracting you from the Lord more? Which one gives you a deeper, more fulfilling relationship with the Lord? And can you decipher that personally? And if you can, and it falls down on one side or the other, then that might be something to follow. What else do you guys see here? Maybe just making sure we capture everything in those passages. So the second passage, it's in a prophetic kind of poem, but what is he talking about, or what do you think he's describing here? Talking about having children.
I think it's possible. I mean, I know someone that's basically in this situation, and because they don't have children, is actually able to minister to like young single and married women.
Yes.
And honestly, has been able to make such an impact that when you talk about having more children, it's almost more like children of God.
Yes.
That you've been helping and creating. And I think it's a beautiful thing in their life, even though it's been really hard for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree. I think he's probably talking about children spiritually, that after the Messiah comes, it says that he will be cut off, he'll have no descendants. But specifically because Jesus was unmarried, and specifically because Jesus died childless, in that act, he redeemed singleness. That's the reason. Singleness has, in the Christian narrative, a high place, and it doesn't really have a high place in sort of the Jewish narrative in the Old Testament, before the coming of Christ. So in the Jewish narrative, kind of the hero archetype is Abraham, who's the uber father. The father, his name means the father of many nations. In Jesus, you have a guy who had no children, never got married, and yet has more spiritual children than Abraham. Has brought more children into Abraham's family than probably pre-existed Abraham physically. That in and of itself redeems singleness, but only to the extent that you actually follow Jesus' example, right? So the idea that you sort of stay single and then don't bear children and say, yeah, the sort of childbearing life is for married people. And the single life is not a reproductive life. You're really not following the pattern that redeems singleness. So I agree. So you see these examples in the Bible and these examples in our day of people who are unmarried and use that opportunity to multiply even more rapidly than a married family could, they're doing something that is really in line with, I think, this gift. And it's an awesome thing.